Kia ora koutou. Welcome along to this Late at the Museum event for October. I'm Finlay Macdonald. I'll be your facilitator this evening, just like every other evening, in case you've been to previous lates. Tonight's subject, as you well know, is crime and justice. According to figures from the International Centre for Prison Studies, which is part of King's College in London, New Zealand imprisons 199 people per 100,000 of its total population. This is not, as is sometimes claimed, the second highest per capita incarceration rate after the United States. It is in fact the 62nd highest per capita rate, and yes, the US is right at the top. We're just below Libya and just above American Samoa, in case you wondered. However, it could be claimed that we are the second country on that unlovely list that might be counted as part of what is sometimes called the developed world. Many of the nations above us are old Eastern Bloc countries, African, South American or Asian. But among them are also relatively developed countries such as Singapore and Israel, though these obviously have cultural and historical and geopolitical explanations for their situations. New Zealand's statistics look worse when you go further down the list. Why, for instance, are we locking up more people per capita than Britain, Australia or Germany? Or to phrase it another way, are we really on average a more criminally inclined country than, say, Italy, Uganda or Yemen? Again, there will be explanations for some countries' relatively low incarceration rates, including that they execute people who might otherwise contribute to the prison muster. But hard questions remain to be asked. Why are we seemingly such a punitive jurisdiction, arguably becoming more punitive as time passes, and is there a better way? To discuss this and a lot more, I'm joined by, in the middle here, Sam Chapman from Project Awhi, community assistance and development charity working in some of New Zealand's poorest communities. Professor Warren Brookbanks, to my immediate left, expert in criminal and mental health law from the Faculty of Law at the University of Auckland. And to my far left, Professor Greg Newbold, criminologist from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Canterbury, a frequent commentator on crime and justice issues, and who wrote a book called The Big Huey in 1981, which actually sparked my own personal interest in this subject all those years ago. So please welcome our panel. And if nothing else, we're going to get a tan from these lights. Sam, picking up on the Māori incarceration rate, which is so wildly out of sync with the European rate, what's your explanation for that? Let's just get that on the table first.
Yeah. I think, history shows us that when you get any people group that's been impacted by change, particularly by how quickly that change happens, the pace of change, you get a huge inability of that society to cope with that. And so as the pressures come on, they then look to coping mechanisms to try to manage that. Without a doubt, Indigenous communities, including Māori, with the impact of colonization, all the pluses and the minuses, but the impact of colonization, the removal of those elements of society that historically have kept you safe, have kept you within the parameters of community and family. When those things are removed and a different culture is imposed on that, you get crises, you get disaster. And I think we are going through that today.
You know what the critics of what you just said say to you, which is you've had centuries now to get over that. Not you particularly, but we have had centuries, hundreds and 150 years. When does it stop being, if not an excuse, an explanation?
Well, we are still going through it now. We are still being impacted by those very same things today. Not too much has changed in those centuries that you refer to. We still live in a very white space world. We have Māori Language Week. Imagine if we had on the newspapers Pākehā Language Week. What that would do to many of us in our communities. Why is it that we're relegated to this kind of imposition, really, of a value system that says this is who you are? And I think, we're not talking about something that's happened in the past, we're talking about things that are happening now. And that's why the Renaissance among Māori has been so crucial and so critical, is that we're trying to restore the memory of who we are as a people. And that's true of any indigenous community around the world. Now, I'm not talking about blame or guilt, because blame consumes you and it's all that sort of stuff. I'm just talking about the reality that we have to face today. And it's what we want to do with that. Is how do we as community, as New Zealanders, face the fact that this is what has happened. We're not looking for blame, we're just saying how do we deal with that kind of reality. And so I think that there are a lot of things that are not just historical, they're here now. And until we face that, we're going to continue with some struggles for some time.
One of the concerns that I have, and it's not widely known and it's certainly not widely popularised, is the fact that amongst our prison cohort, and of course we're speaking here of that 50% Maori cohort, there is a hugely high incidence of recorded traumatic brain injury. There's estimates that up to 87% of prison inmates have experienced some form of traumatic brain injury, whether as a result of accident, sports injury, or criminal assault. The most commonly recorded crime in prisons is assault. Now, when you begin to reflect on that, when you begin to reflect on the fact that there's a significant impact operating in the minds of people who are incarcerated, which results in aggressive behaviour, which results in loss of memory, which results in the inability to socialise, which results in other negative factors, and that these people are going to be ultimately discharged from prisons in the majority of cases, it doesn't augur very well for the future. So somehow we have to acknowledge, because this issue has been completely under the radar, it's spoken about in studies, but it's certainly not part of government policy to address the incidence of traumatic brain injury. Until we address these fundamental issues, which affect particular cohorts in very profound ways, we are not going to have any relief from the recycling problem of crime.
I've heard this argument before that our prison population statistics would look a lot more benign if you factored out the brown people because they're a special case. What do you say to that argument?
I have some real problems with all these stats. Statistics are there for us to have fun with, but my surname is Chapman. Something must have happened in my history to get that handle. But if I go to prison, I'm a Maori. Okay. If you're generous, I'm half caste. I've got both a Māori heritage and a Pākehā heritage. Most of those in prison are the same. So instead of 50% being Māori being in prison, there's only 25% and the rest are Pākehā. We throw around these statistics and there's numbers and many for politicians and of course it's a gravy train as well. But the reality is that we got people who are having to deal with powerlessness, with vulnerability that prevents them from getting access to opportunity, that prevents them from getting the right to choose even, because they're not part of the social power that exists. And our society, I'm convinced, is that we've actually created the problem that we're trying to fix. And we continue to do that. There are some ways I believe that we can reverse that. It may not be popular, but I think we can. And I don't think those who created the problem actually have the solution. I really don't.
You can't separate this discussion out from, or you can't avoid talking about the media in this discussion.
Yeah, people's opinions of crime and the degree of threat that it presents to them are to a large extent created by the media and by sensational events. The few people are aware, for example, that murders in New Zealand are on the decline. They peaked in 1993 and significantly lower than they were in 1993. People wouldn't know that because they read the papers and they see another person has been murdered and thus their fear of crime goes up. when capital punishment was reintroduced in New Zealand in 1950, it was as a result of huge amounts of publicity which had been given to a relatively small number of offences. And that resulted in the reintroduction of capital punishment in 1950, which was repealed in 1961. So the New Zealand public's perception is extremely highly influenced, not only by the media, but by significant individuals within the media, like Garth McVicar. And Garth McVicar himself came out of the Paul Joseph Daly case, or the Carla Cardno case, and that was the case which drove Garth McVicar to form the Sensible Sensing Trust. When Mark Middleton was sent to prison for threatening to kill the killer of his stepdaughter, it was Carla Cardno, there was a massive petition around the country and a change in the law as a result. Now, Daly was due to be released. That's why Middleton threatened to kill Daly. Daly had done his 10 years, and as was the convention at the time, he was due to be released after his 10 years, because that was the minimum, and people normally served about 12 years if they behaved themselves in prison. Now, as a result of that, Daly is still in prison. He's still in prison to this day and may never get out until he's extremely old, and that's totally and solely because of the energy that Mark Middleton put into it. Whether you think it's right or wrong is another matter. I've got no problem with it, but that is the kind of impact that the media and highly profiled people can have.
The logical consequence of that is that no one gets out of prison. I mean, that's where that leads, isn't it? And what happens then? I mean, do we just keep building more prisons? And if not, how do you let these people out and what do you do with them?
With 3 strikes, that's the road we've gone down, that people who commit murders on a second strike will not get out of prison. People commit manslaughters on a 3rd strike will not get out of prison ever. Ever.
What do you think of 3 strikes? He said ridiculous.
I think it's one of the most irresponsible pieces of legislation that's ever been passed by a New Zealand Parliament.
Well, it's not only that, it's a pretext, because it would not have happened had it not been for the coalition agreement between ACT and the national government. It was a trade-off, and I suspect that there were probably many senior politicians in the National Party that didn't want it, but that was part of a deal that they had to support. It was a completely ill-conceived law. It wasn't needed. We already have the penalty of preventive detention, which is being used much more, which means that people can be locked up indefinitely for very serious crimes. And that was certainly adequate, together with the life sentence for murder, to deal with most very serious homicides. I mean, even before 3 strikes, the courts were still imposing minimum non-parole periods of up to 30 years. We didn't need 3 strikes. We simply didn't need it. So
it was window dressing for a policy.
It was driven very powerfully because of the coalition agreement, but it wasn't necessary. It was never in contemplation before certain members of the ACT Party became involved in promoting it, and I don't think it would have happened had it not been for that political arrangement.
Sam,
it was serendipitous. I mean, look, Rodney Hyde wanted Garth McVicar on the ACT Party in order to help the ACT Party get into power. And Garth McVicar didn't want to do it, and he nominated Dave Garrett. Dave Garrett has written a book advocating the return of capital punishment, and he was a very, very strong advocate of 3 strikes. He convinced Rodney Hyde. The ACT Party then went into government with National on the condition that National would support David Garrett in 3 strikes. That's how it happened.
And the rest, as they say, is
That's
history.
lawmaking in New Zealand.
At which point, we'll take 2 or 3 questions, because, time always runs out on us.
Good evening. I've recently met an American gentleman called Kenneth Cloak, who has written a book called Conflict Revolution. If you haven't read it, it's very interesting, and talks about how society can actually only possibly continue if we focus not so much on a rights-based kind of society, but more of a needs and interest-based society. I know that obviously Sam's quite, kind of supportive of that, and I'd just be interested from the panel, can you see that ever happening in the future, that we focus only, well, purely on the needs and in the interests of people rather than on the rights?
Did we catch the gist of that?
Yeah, well, I haven't heard that particular paradigm, but it does make some sense. I mean, there is a very, very great focus internationally on human rights in a whole range of contexts, and one wonders how far you can push that, at least if rights are not also matched by responsibilities. And really what we are interested in is what is in the interests of a community as a whole, what is in its best interests, and how can those interests best be supported, both through social policy and legislation. So I think the rights discourse goes so far, but it doesn't do all the work.
And thank you very much for coming along. I really do appreciate, especially seeing the same familiar faces turning up. It's really rewarding from this side of the blinding lights. And I'd particularly like to thank our panellists tonight, Greg Newbold, Sam Chapman, and Warren Brookbanks,